Thank you for coming. As was mentioned, I am a PhD candidate, but my story is a little longer than that. So I worked as a software developer for a number of years. During that time, I was also involved in some free software open source communities, organizing conferences mostly. And so that is what carried me into my research. Because when you're organizing a conference, you need not just the key organizers, but you also need the people that show up at the conference, the people that are, say, recording you or that are handing out bags at the entrance. You need these casual, or as I call them, episodic contributors. But most of the general recommendations that you will read about as a community organizer are that you should avoid casual contributions. So this was the basis for my research, was what if we consider instead how can we best utilize the contributions of episodic contributors, and how can we encourage them to remain? Because if you have somebody come to your project once and they do something small, that's great, but it's even better if they can come back again in 6 months or a year. I mean, certainly we would all wish for people that are completely dedicated, who have all the free time, who can come and contribute every week, but that's not reality. And this is a trend that has increased in free and open source software with the rise of GitHub, which has standardized interfaces and made it so much easier for people to jump in and make a small contribution, to jump out again. But it's also mirrored by general trends in society. So over the last 20 years, there's been observed in a number of countries that the number of hours that people are volunteering has stayed the same, but the number of people that are volunteering has increased. So what that means is that, of course, you have more people volunteering smaller amounts of time. And so therefore, it's actually necessary for us to care about the casual contributors, even if everybody would dream, of course, of people that have all the time to contribute. So the work that I'm going to present today is based upon mostly my research, although my research has been influenced naturally by my personal experiences, both working as a paid community manager as well as my volunteer work organizing conferences. But I'm also going to present other scholarly work, not just my own, to give a bigger picture. So the reason that I prefer the term episodic contributors to casual contributors is that casual implies a certain lack of devotion, and that isn't necessarily the case. So a lot of times people will shift depending on what else is going on in their life. So at one point they might be very deeply engaged, and then maybe they have a baby or something and they don't have as much time, but then possibly later they hit a period where they can contribute more. So it isn't necessarily about a lack of commitment. Of course, it can be that people contribute less because they are less committed, but it's not necessarily the case. So episodic talks about the nature of their contributions and doesn't imply anything about how committed they are. So when we talk about retention in episodic volunteers, we're not necessarily talking about an escalation of commitment, but about them coming back again. So the person who is filming me today, I assume that the other organizers would like very much if this person were to come back and do the same thing next year. So you want to consider how you can get people to keep coming back and contributing. And another thing to consider, and this really came out in my research, is that most of us, are probably episodic contributors. Now, you might actually be contributing very regularly to one project, but you're probably contributing episodically to a number of other projects. So if you are working on a library and it relies on another library and you spot a bug in that, you're likely to provide a patch. Or maybe you're just using your email client and you spot a bug and you report that. And all these little interactions that we have with other projects, cumulatively it adds up that even the people that are habitual contributors are contributing episodically to a much broader sphere of projects. So this is based on a study of GitHub repository data where we use Jupyter Notebook to analyze contributors to a number of free software and open source projects. And we only looked at people that were contributing in the year 2015, but who had also contributed in 2014 and 2016. And the interesting thing we found was that 36% of the people, even excluding people that didn't contribute for 3 years, only contributed once in that year. So there are a significant number of people that are only making, say, one commit a year, but they're doing it year after year after year. So they're not actually making that many commits. If we look here, it's the percentage of contributions that they made and the number of projects. So close to 200 projects, these contributors accounted for 1% of commits. And for 5% of projects, they accounted for about 25% of commits. Or here's another view of it. This is and I'm sorry, this is really not showing up very well, I'm afraid. This is the percentage of top contributors needed to reach a certain level of code. So the top 2% of contributors contribute on average about 40% of the software. In some projects as high as about 55, and in some projects as low as 25. But that still means that, as you can see, as you increase the number of contributors, there's this little gap, and these people are still contributing. And those are the people that I'm talking about. It may not seem that relevant when you look at how small these contributions are, but the work of episodic contributors isn't just measured by how many commits they do. So research has shown that when you incorporate these casual contributors into your project, there's increased innovation. Usually there are more new features developed. Often there's an increase in software quality. And very importantly, that your project gets known to a wider audience because people talk about it. So when you incorporate these people, you may not consider them all that relevant in terms of the amount of code that they contribute, but they are actually very beneficial to a project in other ways. That was not me. I'm afraid I don't even speak the language. So, as I mentioned, the other reason why you should care is because these people are already in your community. It's not as if ignoring them has made them go away. So the focus of my research has been how to best encourage what we want from episodic contributors. How can we make their work more generally useful? How can we get them to return and continue to make contributions? Because of course when somebody returns, it's in a way easier than a new contributor because they already know your processes. And they're doing many different kinds of work. So in my research, I found that pretty much any type of work that you can imagine in a free and open source software project, people are doing it, although it varies by project. So for instance, in the very large projects, translations are much more tightly controlled, and there's a guidebook, so there's not very many episodic contributors doing translations. But in smaller projects, that's actually a key place where people are jumping in and doing a little bit of translation. So just really everything that you can imagine, from working on conferences, to code contributions, to translations, to documentation. People are working episodically in all these different areas. And the nice part is that many of the practices that are already in place in communities are also applicable to episodic contributors, which is in some ways, of course, not surprising, seeing as people can move in and out of an episodic state. So episodic contributors really are, in many ways, just like habitual contributors. So the practices that are most relevant are those that focus on their particular constraint, which happens to be time. Typically, episodic contributors can be thought of as belonging to two different types. You have your generalist contributors and the specialist contributors. So the specialist contributors are people that have intense expertise in their own area, which is unrelated to your project. So, for instance, somebody that comes and does the audio at a conference is probably something of an expert at the audio, but might not be deeply involved in that particular project. Whereas a generalist is somebody that doesn't have any very domain-specific knowledge, but just wants to help out. So for specialist contributors, the best thing that you can do is to separate their domain knowledge from the specific details of your project, to make it easier for them to do what they know how to do without having to get bogged down in the details. So another example might be if you have a lawyer who is working with your software to help ensure that you can deal with a particular trademark issue. Well, that person doesn't need to know about the internal details of the project. They probably don't need to know very much about the project at all. They have their own area of expertise. So for generalist contributors, you are looking for tasks that are somewhat narrowly focused, that don't require significant setup or build for them to be able to get started. So containers have been actually very great for that, to allow people to get a working environment much more quickly than they could in the past. But one other way that you should consider using generalist contributors is to have them work on those tasks that interfere with what your habitual contributors are doing. So things that take time away from people doing what they want to do is a good thing to set your generalist episodic contributors on. So this is a framework that was developed originally for people who were participating in a cancer run. But what I'm showing here are my results from a survey conducted on episodic volunteers. And these are 5 different factors that affect the intention of an episodic contributor to remain in a community. I'll go into them in more detail, but what you can spot immediately is that satisfaction and organizational commitment are the 2 factors that really matter a lot in terms of keeping people in a community and getting them to come back and time again. Whereas the other 3 factors put a lot less weight. So approximately 42%, 41% of the entire decision to remain can be predicted from finding out about a person's satisfaction or organizational commitment. So what are they? Utility motives is when a person is motivated to contribute because they are going to get some benefit out of it, something that benefits them personally. So one of those motives is volunteering to make money, and that has a negative effect on intention to remain. So it's probably not a very good motive. But the other personal motives, like a desire to develop new skills, or to get recognition, or to improve one's job opportunities, these don't have a negative impact on a person's intention to remain. They do have a slight positive impact. Of course, utility motives are not the only reason that people can be motivated to join. People can also be motivated to join out of enjoyment and socializing, which are more associated with retention than the personal benefit motives. And one thing to consider here is that people with the enjoyment and socializing motives are more discouraged by technical barriers to entry. So if you want to encourage people who come for enjoyment and socializing, you want to work on making your technical barriers as low as possible. I suppose it's that people are more willing to forgive flaws in areas that they're deeply interested in. So actually having the best socialization platform is less important to people who want to socialize than having a low technical entry point. So social norms. This is about how people perceive the community around them feels about their contributing. And this is something I didn't think would be much of a factor in free software and open source, because it tends to be more separated from the community than many other forms of volunteering. But I was surprised to find that it is still, in fact, a factor. And more specifically, I found that people who are working in areas outside of code contributions were quite likely to originally join because they received a personal invitation. A friend or a relative said, hey, do you want to help out with this? And then they helped out and kept coming back. So you may think that we're not so easily influenced by the people around us because so much of what we're doing is online. But actually, there is a connection to the community that you're a part of, and it does affect people's willingness to continue participating. Now, a psychological sense of community, by contrast, is about how a person feels when they first encounter the community in question. Do they feel welcome, supported, and inspired to do things? So one of the things that was frequently mentioned by my respondents here was inclusivity, and also how so many projects have changed a lot in the last 20 years with codes of conduct and other measures to try to make people feel welcome. So that is a factor for a certain number of people in whether they come back. A satisfaction, that was the one that had the biggest impact, and indeed it was what people usually talked about when they talked about remaining in a community. And this is after you've been in the community a little while. So the first three factors sort of happen before you join the community or at the moment that you first join the community, whereas satisfaction happens only after exposure and experience with the community. And satisfaction is essentially, did the experiences match the expectations? And there's a lot of aspects like that, having fulfilling social interactions with other people, feeling that your work is useful, feeling that you're appreciated. So this is the #1 reason why episodic contributors come back. So one of the community managers that I've been working with in my research has as his community a particular goal to try to recognize the episodic contributors. So they have a release cycle, and they have people that only show up at one point in the release cycle, say at the testing phase. And sometimes people will say, oh, hey, it's great to see a new person here. And the person will feel slightly offended because, well, actually, I've been doing this for 6 years, but only at these little points, so somebody who's there all the time doesn't really recognize them as a repeated returning contributor. So one of the objectives there is to try to recognize the people that are coming back so that they feel that their work is appreciated. So, organizational commitment is the other factor that has a lot of impact in somebody's intention to remain. And this is when somebody identifies as a member of the community. They feel aligned to the community and its objectives, and they see themselves in the role of a volunteer to this community. The interesting thing that I found out about this is that the people who talk about their involvement to others outside of the group, so to their friends, families, colleagues, are also more likely to want to remain. So the more vocal people are very likely to want to remain. So what are the problems that community managers are having with episodic contributors or episodic contributions? So out of a list of problems that I identified through a Delphi study with community managers, these were the top ones. And the #1 one was that episodic contributors are not aware of the opportunities to contribute. So 87% of the people, it's not a representative sample, but it is a very broad spectrum, had that particular problem in their community. So it's a very common problem. There were also problems about making plans, the quality of the work, the completion of the work, finding the right kind of tasks, and mismatched expectations. So I can't tell you yet what the solutions are to these problems because that's my current ongoing research. I can only tell you that these are the problems. However, I do have some suggestions on how to identify some solutions for your project or your community. And there is no magic bullet. I've been working on this for 5 years. If there was a very simple solution, surely it would be known by now. But what you can do is consider your community, which of course you know far better than I do. Different communities have different characteristics, and you can consider the things that tend to motivate episodic contributors and the things that tend to demotivate them. And then you can also think of what your main goal is. Do you want to understand them better and their motivations? Do you want to get more people to join? Do you want to retain your casual contributors more? Or do you want to try to encourage them to return more often? What is your primary goal? Where are you seeing the shortcomings of how episodic contributors are working in your community now? I would suggest that as the first point of focus. Then I would look at the 5 factors and try to figure out what practices that you're already using or that you're not already using might be able to support your goals. So my next research, the one I'm working on now, I hope to have a list of some additional practices that can be used and when they can be applied, but I don't have that yet. The thing to remember, of course, is that most practices are probably already in place, they're probably already working reasonably well for episodic contributors because you have episodic contributors in your community, but they might need tweaking. So here, for instance, is an example practice that came out of an interview study. You might encourage people who are episodic contributors, who have been working in your community for some time, to talk about their participation. The reason you might do that is that personal invitation is an effective method of recruitment, as we saw from social norms, and also the people who are talking about their involvement usually want to remain, although I cannot infer any causality from that, just that there is a correlation between these factors. So what could you do as a community to support this? Well, for instance, you could prepare an introductory set of slides about your community, and you could make these available to members of your community, and you could encourage them to go speak at local conferences or local groups that are not specifically about your community. Or you could prepare some social media material and ask people to help that proliferate. So you could provide some content and a gentle nudge in the hopes that people would start sharing their experiences and telling people outside of free and open source software world and outside of your community about what they're doing, why it's interesting, and why others might want to participate. So I wanted to talk very briefly about the research that's not yet complete. In the group of the 5 factors, you can actually subdivide the people into 4 different categories. So this is something else you might want to consider. These groups are of about equal size, but you can segment people. You have one group of people who participate almost entirely out of a sense of community. So they are the organizational commitment people, but they answer questions like, people would be disappointed in me if I decided to stop contributing. So those are what I call the obligated volunteers, people that feel that others are depending on them, and that's the main reason that they stay. Another group were what I called the satisfied volunteers, and that they are satisfied, having a good experience is the only thing that matters to them. None of the other factors have any influence whatsoever, well, except the tiniest bit, and sometimes even negative, in their intention to remain. They only care that they're continuing to enjoy the experience. Another group was what I called the proud volunteers. They're the ones who like to talk about their involvement, and they really feel like they're a member of the community, and it's a great community, and it's the best community that there could be, and they're very proud of their involvement in it, and they want to talk to other people. And then there are the people that don't fit into one of these 4 categories. So these groups are all of about equal size. So I'm going to stop here and take any questions that you may have.
Okay.
Oh, and my slide stopped showing, but I was going to give you the URL to be able to read my academic papers if you want. Yes, thank you. So if you want to actually read my research papers, there's a few different links there where you can access my research papers. Or if you just want a summary of my research, but I would say in more depth, but as of last November, so things have progressed. I've included a lot of things that were not present before. There's also an article on opensource.com from November that goes into some of these things in a lot more detail, although not as recent as what I'm presenting today.
Right, thank you, Anne. We didn't get any questions yet on Slido. Please, if you want to ask questions that way, you can go to slido.com. Otherwise, does anybody have a question from the audience? You don't have to go through the online stuff. Do I see any hands? There's one.
First, thank you for your talk. Very curious, especially from the point of view of former project leader. One question about 5 factors. So I was a bit surprised to see psychological factors scoring so lowly. It was like 1% or 10%. I don't remember. But 2 questions coming from it. Did you ask people about their top 1 factor, or did you ask about all factors?
Mm-hmm. So that particular research, what it was a survey of episodic contributors across multiple open source projects. So like I asked people to participate at FOSDEM and a number of other conferences. And each of those factors is actually a compound variable that is made up of multiple questions that describe that particular factor. So for each of these factors, there was a 5-point Likert scale where people were able to say that they agree or disagree strongly, agree strongly, and 3 points in between. And there were between 3 to 9 measures for each factor. And the measures that I used were ones that have been previously validated by other research. I adapted them to an open source context, did some pilot testing to make sure that the language was understandable to people, and so that's where those measures came from.
Right, thank you. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I'm sure Anne will be around to answer any more questions.
Anne will not be around because Anne has to catch a bus.
Oh.
But I will be on Twitter.
All right, or you can run
answer email
to the bus.
Oh, I answer email, yeah.
Right, thank you, Anne.